Um, I think since the reference to pirates was made, and in particular the Somali pirates, I must gloss it a bit. I think this merchant vessel called Progressive Global Governance, PGG, I think it's a flag of convenience. I don't know what flag it has, but nevertheless, carries a cargo of very many precious oxymorons. And that may or may not tempt even the most seasoned Somali pirate. So it's my job to put to this cargo of oxymorons some buxymorons and see what might eventually be the fate of the cargo vessel as it's passed through the high seas. First of all, I think I suggested this morning in my brief comment the question of going beyond binaries, logic of binary notions to logic of paired concepts. So if you asked what was the other of governance, I suggested the other of governance, good PGG would be progressive global resistance. Don't you think a nice idea? Now I want to elaborate it a little bit. I want to say that we cannot grasp PGG in its fullness without understanding PGR, progressive global resistance. Therefore, we have to decode both narratives of resistance and governance. I think what we heard today, but more particularly in the previous session, and now about the zones of exclusion, in a different vein, is that the object of desire of the PGG captains is 4 or 5 types of privatizations. Privatization of governance, privatization of state, privatization of the idea of public reason, privatization, of course, of the idea of development, and privatization of the idea of justice and rights. And I think this is 4 or 5 types of appropriations which result into colonization of human rights, as my friend Anna Greer, who writes on rights of multinationals, describes it. The colonization of human rights has converted, while I recognize your point about it being the platform through which we name exclusion and also fight it, perhaps the only platform. Nevertheless, what is happening today descriptively is an emergence of a new paradigm of human rights, which I name as TRMF, trade-related market-friendly human rights, in contradistinction with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights paradigm. I've spoken about it elsewhere. The contrasts are, of course, certainly obvious. So the colonization of human rights, languages, logics, and rhetorics is also a part of progressive global governance. And I think to say this is to cryptically also suggest the task of resistance. It's the decolonization of the idea of human rights, the appropriation of the ideas of justice and development, and so on. So that's my first point. But I need to say in this regard, one more by way of a footnote, speak to you about this new animal in the zoo of global jurisprudence, which is called global rule of law. I call it GROL. And GROL is primarily an instrumentality of PGG. Forgive my acronyms, but it is sometimes useful. Till you forget what the acronym stands for, it's very convenient to have them. We had a very nice system of translation of acronyms in India, pure fun. So we had various UN bodies, and we had a body called UNCTAD, UNCTAD, which stood, perhaps some of you may not remember, for United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And we used to, in a typical Baxi moment of fun, we said UNCTAD stands for this: under no circumstances take any decision. And this is what happens. So acronyms are very useful, but sometimes one can do mischief with them. But GRO, Global Rule of Law, invites three questions. One, what are the sources of global rule of law? Second, what is its normative content? And thirdly, who are the bearers of obligation, which are the communities of duties that are constituted by that. And I won't take you very far into this meditation, excepting to say that GROL is a self-manifesting aspect of, the Lord Buddha and the theory of independent origination of the world. That the origination has no cause. So this is a kind of manifest self-originating notion. You cannot identify as a source of global rule of law international customary law with much ease. You may not be able to derive its source from what international law is called jus cogens, the peremptory norms of international law. The history of ICC and the position of hegemonic powers in relation to particularly US and a would-be member of Permanent Security Council, India, in company with Libya, Iraq, and Israel, that did not ratify the treaty on the grounds of various grounds. Whenever they didn't recognize the idea that there are certain jus cogens aspect to international rule of law. And then there is, of course, and I'm very grateful to you, Isabella, for reuniting with me, with Richard Falk. And he spoke to us this morning about soft law and soft power. So there might be questions about sources of rule of law into this diffuse body of gestures and articulations of counterpower. I will not go into other aspects of it, what is the normative content, and what is but I'll go to the third question, who are the obligation bearers? Much of the normative content of international rule of law would depend on how we source it. And if we can't source it too clearly, we can't derive the normative content too specifically. The global rule of law is very different from national rule of law. And I think that's where Professor Sassen's point is very important, of intersecting regimes, of points of arrival and departure, of trafficking between levels of governance. There's a certain degree of suppleness about that notion as against the idea of a regime. So adopting that, I think there are certain things that can happen in national courts and in national development which may not ever happen under the name of rule of law in a global society. Let me give just one example. Many of the leading courts in the global south, particularly India, South Africa, Brazil, among others, have translated the notion of rule of law into one maxim, that sovereign public power is a fiduciary power, that is held in trust for rights, development, and justice. It's unlikely that any of the international dispute forum would concretize global rule of law in this way, and quite rightly, because we cosmopolitans don't want a global government, and therefore there's a diffuse process of, decentralized process of interpretation of international law. I think, I don't know how I got into the global rule of law, but the general idea was that what makes it progressive is the notion of international rule of law, and which is under whose name many performances of power are committed, as Richard Falk this morning alerted us to. The third third point I wish to make is about, apropos Richard's talk this morning, is about devising narratives of, assuming there is such a thing as international rule of law, devising its progress narratives. And it seemed to me that global rule of law is a notion specifically developed to administer amnesia, historic amnesia, for the contributions of the non-European others. And I think this is an important, for example, how far did the post-colonial struggles, which lasted for nearly 70 years, may have shaped the sources, content, and the scope of global rule of law? It's a question rarely asked, how far socialist revolutions might have contributed, particularly the idea of Lenin of self-determination of nationalities, how far the Arab Spring might be read to contribute. The question I'm raising is, global rule of law becomes another type of Enlightenment progress narrative, where the element of historic originality in people's struggle to define ideas of rights, development, and justice are considered merely as replications of the bicentennial mindsets and histories. So the question of mimesis versus originality is, I think, of some moment. Am I on time or a couple of minutes? 10 minutes. Oh, very good. 10 minutes or seconds? All right. Now I want to jumble up another, I want to go to another territory, namely, 5 minutes, thank you. Another concern of mine is about the notion of reason in global governance and reason in all governance. What constitutes public reason is a question that has recently been more acutely raised by Professor John Rawls, both in his book Political Liberalism and the Law of Peoples, and also in a different way by Jürgen Habermas, into which the disagreement I would not go into here, I don't have the time. But it seems to me that Rawls makes a very important contribution to understanding the reason for providing standards for critiquing the reason of progressive global governance. How does it do so? He does it in two ways. He first of all provides us with a distinction between public and non-public reason. And secondly, he makes a distinction, as you know well, between what is rational and what is reasonable. So what is the means and rationality may not still produce a reasonable outcome. It may produce an efficiency outcome, but not a just outcome, not an outcome on which everybody can agree. And you've got examples like war on terror, for example, in flexible labor markets. You've got examples of immunities and impunities of multinational capital. You've got examples of conversion of human rights into global social policy, like the Millennium Development Goals. These are all examples of tendencies that are rational, but progressive global resistance practices question their reasonableness. And I think the distinction is something that we need to look at. Finally, and I think I had a long chapter here in my written essay, on diversity, and which I think you've already spoken about, of something that we call global governance. There are technical global governance institutions which have never been faulted on the ground of the hegemony of Western domination, like the Universal Postal Union or the Satellite Convention. What Pashokan is called, if you remember, the distinction between technical and political regulation. But the whole range of arrangements on radio waves, on laws of the sea, on the laws of air traffic, which we consider as not worthy subject of a Gramscian or Hegelian critique, because there is something about it which is, I don't say that it is totally depoliticized, but I do say that it does not involve ideological debates. That was Pashukhani's point, summarily put. But there are political institutions, which are a large number, and which always invite contests of ideology, of progressiveness or regressiveness, and so on. There are also international adjudicative institutions. And I think international adjudication and international judicial process networks, where the WTO dispute tribunal, World Bank panel, all kinds of dispute settling agencies, how far they contribute to the progressive global governance is a factor that I think Richard raised this morning in relation to the Nicaragua case. But I think we need a more sustained understanding of the relationship between international judicial process and political global governance. And I think I'll end finally by referring to what I call, in contrast to global public reason, global insurgent reason. And by insurgent reason, I mean reason that questions the rationality of the international governance process and decision-making. I distinguish it from popular and sentimental reason, which is the reason of human rights, which questions the unreason of globalization. By insurgent reason, I specifically mean a cluster of attributes, and very summarily put, first, resistance to ground theory, resistance to totalizing theory of explanation of understanding. Second, the idea of freedom to tell one's stories, narrative rights, human rights as a species of right to narrate one's stories, and as involving destruction of what Lyotard called narrative monopolies or narrative oligarchies. There's only one way of understanding the world. Insurgent reason is an interlocutory reason, which, to adopt a phrase of Gadamer, not merely asks questions, but questions the questionability of what is questioned. And I think this is very important and a telling difference. Not all insurgent reason is necessarily committed to a project of ethical violence. Some practices of insurgent reason are committed to practices of ethical violence, but a considerable number of practices of insurgent reason are inherently nonviolent, aspiring to new articulations of constituent power, power to reshape the future of politics. I need not give examples. Mohandas Gandhi has always been mentioned. Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Aung San Suu Kyi, and many other people, like most of us in the hall, who are practitioners of insurgent reason in one way or the other, without occasionally acknowledging that. People whom Richard Falk once beautifully named as citizen pilgrims. The citizen pilgrims idea is a powerful example of insurgent reason. And to end this rather vagabond presentation, I would say that insurgent reason has also a capacity to imagine future, not, as Richard said, I think, as a continuation of the past or present, but future as a love of and for time, as Antonio Negri suggests in his book on insurgency. Therefore, all I've tried to do here in this magnificent discourse is to invite your attention to ways of deconstruction of the idea of international rule of law, ways of questioning the reason of the global rule of law, ways of articulating the disarticulated linkages between public reason and reason of struggle, insurrectionary reason, and ways of working out a non-miscellaneous understanding of the practices of resistance to global power. Thank you.